everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 250 library systems across 37 states with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful, best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our Author Talk series year-round. Today, we are so honored and excited to have National Book Award finalist and highly acclaimed writer and professor, Dr. Grace M. Cho, with us to talk about her memoir, War. I am very, very excited to dive in, but
I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Before we begin, let me do that quick housekeeping information so that everything runs more smoothly for all of our viewers, and then we will learn a lot more about our guest. We've compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we will also be taking your additional questions throughout our conversation. So when you have a direct question for Dr. Cho, you can click that questions button that's below this video. Just click that at any time to submit your question. In addition, we invite you to interact with your fellow viewers in the live chat box, also located below the stream. It's always fun to see where everybody is tuning in from. If you're unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will receive a thank you for attending email in approximately 24 hours. And in that email, you can find a link to the recording so you can finish watching. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today, Dr. Grace M. Cho is a professor of sociology at City University of New York's College of Staten Island. She received a PhD in sociology and women's study from the City University of New York Graduate Center and a master's in education from Harvard School of Education. Her work crosses disciplinary boundaries and seeks to engage popular audiences. She's the author of Tastes Like War, the book of note today, a finalist for the 2021 National Book Award for Nonfiction, and the winner of the 2022 Asian Pacific American Literature Award for Adult Nonfiction. Time and NPR named it as one of the best books of 2021. Her first book, Haunting the Korean Diaspora, Shame, Secrecy, and the Forgotten War, was the recipient of a 2010 book award from the American Sociological Association. Welcome, Dr. Cho. Thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much.
We are super excited to dive in. We have a lot of great questions. So let's just get started. Jamie is asking, what made you write this story? So I think that's the perfect question to start off with, because we always like to hear kind of a summary of the book as well.
Yeah. So, I want to answer that question not just in terms of why I wrote this book, but why I write more generally. And so if you've read the memoir, then you know that there were a couple of transformative moments during my adolescence and early adulthood that really sort of set the path for a life of research, investigation into my family history, and then writing. So the first one was when I was 15 years old. And it became pretty evident to me that my mom was suffering from some sort of a mental illness, which I myself sort of diagnosed as schizophrenia by checking out books from the high school library. And it was this incredibly difficult moment for me because I didn't really get any support from anyone in my family. When I spoke with my dad and my brother about it, they both were in denial about it, and they basically punished me for saying that. I then went to the community mental health care center to try to seek help for her myself, and they turned me away, told me that there was nothing that I could do for her. And so it was sort of this moment where I started to see my mom differently as a person who was, sort of was seen as disposable by our society. So I think that was sort of the beginning of my sociological thinking and trying to ask hard questions about what our society does to people. And then it was right on the eve of my 23rd birthday, I learned this family secret that my mother had been a sex worker in South Korea for American personnel. And so that was a completely devastating moment for me, because it was shocking, first of all, to find out that there was so much about my family that I myself didn't know, and that this had been kept a secret from me. And also because I didn't realize how much shame I had internalized. So then I started to think about this idea of shame as almost like a political tool that governments, institutions will use to get people to internalize that as a private shame, rather than something that should belong to the institution that is committing a type of violence. And so that was sort of what led me to my first book, in which I examined the legacy of the Korean War, and especially as it relates to state-sponsored sexual labor for the U.S. military in South Korea. And it was an academic book, but I acknowledged in the book that I had a connection to this history through my mother. Towards the end of her life, we had conversations about that book, and she was really looking forward to reading it, or seeing it in print. I'm not sure how much of it she could have read, because she did have limited literacy. But then during the production of the book, she suddenly died and I still don't know what the cause of her death was. And so when I was dealing with the shock and grief of her death, all of these other memories came back to me of my mom from before she had schizophrenia, all of these early childhood memories. And in almost all of those memories, she was cooking, she was feeding people, she was foraging. And so it was sort of like this moment of recovering the mother that I had forgotten. Mm-hmm. And so that was sort of the moment when I started writing some of the pieces that ended up in Tastes Like War. When I wrote down those memories just because I didn't want to forget them again, without actually thinking that it was going to turn into a memoir. But over time, it sort of came together as a way of trying to recover all of these different mothers that I had through my life, in varying states of mental anguish, struggle, but also just sort of thinking about how our relationship transformed through this process. And so I guess that's sort of in a nutshell why I wrote this book, because it is sort of a tribute to my mother, and also part of the memory work that I've been doing my whole life, and trying to understand the deeper meaning behind my mother's mental illness. Because even when I was 15 years old, and this was in 1986, I did not ever buy the narrative that mental illness is simply just a chemical imbalance in someone's brain. Mm-hmm. That was never satisfying to me. And so I've always sort of sought explanations in the social and the political.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful explanation. To summarize, Dean is asking, or he's saying that the text is described as a hybrid text, part food memoir, part sociological investigation. And he's asking if you can expand more on hybrid text, and why did you choose to do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it comes from my background, which is that I didn't study creative writing or even set out to become a writer early on in my adult life. I followed the path of academia and sociological study. And when I was working on my first book, my mentor at the time really encouraged me to use creative methods, to use some creative writing and mix it in. I did some performance artwork. I did a type of writing called autoethnography, where you study something from the inside of your own life. And so I sort of developed that method with the first book for various reasons, but one of which was that, academic writing is really dry and disengaging much of the time. And also when thinking about, I was writing about a history that had really been repressed on many different levels. Like the narrative was repressed on many different levels. And so to recover it, I wanted to use all of these different narrative methods in doing so, to try to get at the idea that there are many different angles to a story, many different aspects and perspectives on history. And so that was something that just sort of became my style, my writing style. Mm-hmm. And so I followed through with that with my memoir. And also because I am a scholar, I wanted to fold in some of that scholarship, because I think that's really valuable for the general readership, mm-hmm. to be able to read something, that sort of is, has the feel, has the feel of creative writing where it's very engaging and very sensory, but you also learn a lot from it.
Absolutely.
That's me as a professor wanting to, teach people things.
To take one of your classes. So one of my favorite things about this book was the way that you intertwined history into you and your mother's personal story. It was artistry. It was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to learn more. I wanted to keep reading. The first time that really stuck out to me in the beginning is when we get the anecdote behind the title of
Mm-hmm.
the book, with your mother's memory of powdered milk. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So the title comes from something that my mother said about powdered milk. So growing up, and even well into my adult life, she never talked about the Korean War. So she was 9 years old. She was 9 years old at the time that the war started, or when it actually escalated to what we now know as the Korean War. There had been elements of the war for a few years before that. But I knew, I had the sense that she was traumatized by it, but that she could not really talk about it. And so this was one of the first occasions when I ever heard her volunteer some memory of the war. And it took place when she was, at this point, a shut-in. She was living in an apartment that my brother renovated on his property for her to live in. A very comfortable place for her, I think. But she had a lot of challenges with food and with eating during this time in her life, which is pretty common for people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia. They have a lot of challenges with food. And one of the things that my sister-in-law had left there for her was a box of powdered milk. And I asked her why she hadn't touched it. And that she said, "I can't stand the taste of it. It tastes like war." And so that statement was really a revelation to me, because I think that my own relationship with food is much more positive. And I don't tend to have really traumatic associations with food. And so it was almost like this light bulb went off in my head that we can think about food memories, not just as those warm, fuzzy memories, of our grandmothers or whatnot, which are so common in food memoir, but also that the taste of a food can trigger a memory that's traumatic, that opens up all of this feeling. So that's where the title comes from.
It's beautiful. I love the way that you intertwined the personal story and the history. It was excellent. Katie's asking, did you struggle with the decision to write such a personal book, knowing that it was going to be out there for everyone to read? And how did you get the courage to share your story?
It's so interesting because people always, every time I do a book talk, somebody says something about how I have courage, or they ask me about how I have the courage. I have never really thought of myself that way. Because, going back to what I shared at the beginning, those moments, like when I was 15 and then 23, they were so profoundly life-changing to me. They really shaped who I am and the way that I live in the world. And so the most important thing to me has always been to try to, fight for some sort of justice that allows people to be seen for who they are without hiding the things that are stigmatic about them. Mm-hmm. And so that was what I wanted for my mom's story. I wanted the story to be really complex so that she was not just reduced to these labels that have so much stigma attached to them, psychotic, schizophrenic, sex worker, that she was a full human being. And so that was really what drove me for years and years. I mean, decades. My entire writing life has been about that, more or less. But, I think for the other question about something that's so personal that I know it'll be out there for a long time, I knew that there might be some consequences from, like maybe from other family members who didn't want me to do this. But the thing is, with my first book, when I had an opportunity to talk to my mom about it, she was supportive of that project. And so she was the person who has always been the most important to me in my family. So I've always sort of felt like it was an instance of me standing up for her in a way, in addition to doing things just out of my own desire and my own need to sort of unravel this trauma, but also because I know that there are a lot of people who can relate to it. And I've gotten that feedback quite a lot from people who said that they they see themselves in several aspects of the story, you know, and I've heard from people from many different walks of life, you know, not just what I had expected. I sort of expected it to be another sort of niche book for Korean Americans, but I've heard from a lot of people beyond that demographic.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you knew that some of your family members would be against you writing the book. Did their questioning of your perspective cause you to pause or reevaluate your memories? And
They
um,
never they never questioned my perspective. I actually haven't spoken with them for you know, I haven't spoken. I've been estranged from those family members for many years.
Mhm.
And I you know, like I haven't seen or spoken to my brother for 10 years now. I did write to him to let him know that my memoir was coming out.
Mhm.
And I never got a response. And I mean, that was before it was published. So, you know, there was no request to see it or no questions about what was in it. Um, so yeah, so I never actually had any of those conversations that, you know, I think that often people do have when they're writing memoirs and they're trying to negotiate family relationships.
Mhm. Marilyn's asking, just more generally, did writing this book change any aspect of your own emotional experience or memory? Did it involve some type of evolution of your sense of what you wrote about, which you've kind of talked about already? It kind of
Yeah,
trailers what you write about.
yeah, it's really interesting because I think that through the writing of it, not just the writing of it, but now, I mean, because the book got a lot of attention and I've been asked to speak about it a lot, like every time I speak about it, it sort of, I feel like it reinforces this feeling for me that this work is helping to keep the memory of my mother alive.
Mhm.
Um, but another thing that happened was that, you know, I sort of describe in the prologue of the book that I had 3 mothers in my lifetime, and that the 3rd mother was this one that sort of transformed this through a relationship that I had around meals, around sharing Korean meals with her. Um, but I think that that 3rd mother really fully developed through the writing of her, you know, because it was by putting it all down on paper and looking at the story over and over again that I started to really change my perception of who she was.
Mhm.
You know, that I you know, even after it was published, like as I reread it and reread parts of it, the parts that I come back to over and over again are the ones that sort of challenge this idea that someone who hears voices is automatically pathological and that those voices don't mean anything and it's just a symptom of a broken brain. And so I've come to see her as someone who had a lot more agency than I once thought she had. So it has been really, I guess, restorative for me because in a way it has allowed me to get that mother back from my childhood in a lot of different ways.
Mhm. We had several questions. Well, it's a book about your mother and you growing up. With several questions about your dad.
Mhm.
He specifically is asking, how was your dad involved a lot in your upbringing, and how did he factor in throughout all of these years?
Mhm. Well, my dad was a merchant marine, so he was gone for about 6 months out of the year. He was, you know, on a ship, or he was in, you know, in Asia in various cities. So he was involved in my life, but, you know, intermittently.
Mhm.
And so I mean, I have a lot of fond memories of him from the earlier part of my childhood. Things started to go sour once I got older, you know, first because I felt somewhat alone in, you know, in my desire to get help from my mom because he was totally in denial about what was going on with her. Um, and then when I went, I mean, I think things really went south when I went away to college and developed my own, you know, critical consciousness
Mhm.
that was independent of the kinds of things that I had learned within my family. You know, so I started to challenge some of the things that I had learned growing up. And, you know, and my dad was also much older than my mom. And so he was really like, he was older than most of my friends' grandparents.
Mhm.
And so I think that you know, the generational difference, and particularly with my dad being white, he didn't understand at all my identity, the identity that I was developing when I was in college as a person of color. And he didn't understand like why I would be offended if he made a sort of casually racist comment here and there, you know. So And unfortunately, because he was a lot older, we didn't have enough time to work out some of those issues, because I think if he had lived longer, if he had lived long enough for me to mature more, because I was in my 20s when he died, I think that we could have probably repaired that relationship somewhat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hannah's asking, how did you choose which parts of your story to include and what not to include in the final draft? Did you think it was clear from the beginning, or did you have to keep cutting things out?
Yeah, well, I wrote every piece almost as a separate piece.
Okay.
So I had a lot of pieces to work with, and then, then I started to see where there were, maybe some things missing that I wanted to include, and then I would write a new piece, and that would become a new chapter. But there were 2 chapters that didn't make it into the final, and one of them was about my dad. But just because it kind of felt like it didn't fit.
Mm.
Because the structure of it sort of moves all over the place. It moves forward and backward in time. It sort of moves between these different voices. That my way of focusing it was really to try to keep the story about my relationship with my mom. So that was one way in which I made the decision to cut that out, and my editor agreed with me. And initially, I said, I don't want the book to be longer than 300 pages, just because often when I read books that are long, well, memoirs in particular that are longer than that, sometimes I think like the pacing sort of drags a little bit sometimes. Yeah. So she agreed to take that one out. I had another chapter that was supposed to be the last chapter, but when I finished writing the last chapter that actually appears in the book, then I knew, I just had the feeling. So that was an instance in which I just knew that should be the end.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you identify that you had 3 mothers in the prologue, and then you said that that third mother was developed over writing this book, and kind of every time you have a book talk. Did you write the prologue before you finished the book, or did you write the prologue after?
After, yeah, the prologue was the last thing I wrote.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the 3 different versions of the mother were there, but I think that my understanding of it and making meaning of how in that last phase of her life, she was different because our relationship was different, that only made sense to me once I finished all the work, and then I wrote the prologue.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like I said, it is sort of sprawling in a lot of ways because it covers a lot of time, and there are all these different voices in it, that I wanted that prologue to sort of frame things a little bit for the reader before going into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I loved the prologue. I thought that it did its job. It did exactly what you wanted it to do. I want to back up just a little bit because we have quite a few questions about like the beginning of your mother's story. Specifically, Thomas is asking, how did your mother come to live in the United States?
Well, so in South Korea, especially during the time period in which, I was born, Korean women who had any sort of relationship with American men were highly stigmatized and ostracized from the society. And if you had biracial children, if you were one of those women and you had children with an American or a foreigner, but usually American, the children didn't have any sort of citizenship rights. And so, I think that in my mom's situation, and also for many of the women for whom that was true, leaving Korea and going to the United States was more a kind of exile than anything else. It wasn't just part of this narrative we have that immigrants come here because they're seeking the American dream. I mean, there was some element of that was true as well, because I think my mom really did believe in that idea of the American dream, but it was also that life there was just no longer livable. And my father was willing to marry her and take us to the United States.
You also kind of learned about a secret about your mother in a roundabout way when you were talking about taking a job in the service industry, and she discouraged you from it. And Luanda is asking, did your mother ever verbally share with you that she was a sex worker at any point in her life? And when did she say so, and what was happening at that time? And I kind of felt like that's when you got your first inkling that she may have been in sex work, when she was discouraging you from service industry. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think that I was not conscious of that at that moment.
Okay.
it was just something I thought about retrospectively. Like once I knew, then it made sense that she discouraged me from doing any sort of physical labor. My mother never told me. I found out from my sister-in-law, and then I verified it with my father and brother, and then many years later, when I was talking about my first book with my mom. But what's interesting in each of those conversations was that nobody could say those words, so they were these, in my first book, I write about the psychoanalytic idea of the taboo word that becomes a ghost in the unconscious and then gets passed down through the generations, the family secret. Because each of these conversations did not involve saying the word sex worker, prostitution, anything like that. It was more, for example, with my dad, I said, I know how you met mom. And then he teared up and said she did that as seldom as possible, and I got her out of there. So it's implied in the conversation, but not explicitly stated. And then with my mom, when I was telling her about my first book, what I said to her was, I know what you did in Korea, and I don't want you to be ashamed of it. Mm-hmm. And so she sort of nodded her head and then like gave a little smile. So she didn't, again, so sort of talking about it without actually saying the words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. Like you said earlier that you refuse to believe that mental health is just like a chemical imbalance in the brain. And Martha and Catherine are asking, were you looking for a trigger event then specifically for your mother? And Catherine is expanding, saying that your book definitely resonated with me. My parents lived through the Korean War, but refused to talk about it. Mm-hmm. It's been a blank book for decades. How did you research in order to provide that background of your mother's lived experience and like kind of looking for these trigger events?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was, really sort of a dilemma when I first started doing research to think about how to research something that my mom wouldn't talk about.
Yeah.
And so I just looked at it more broadly. I said, okay, so this is the context for her life and her upbringing, and that's what I'm going to study. I'm going to study civilian experiences of the Korean War. I'm going to study the experiences of these women who are doing sexual labor for Americans, without honing in on anything that I could say for sure was my mom's experience. It's just that I know what the context is and I know what the environment is. And then once in a while, especially towards the end of her life, as we got closer over these shared meals, then she would start to open up and tell me little bits of information about her childhood or her youth that helped me fill in the story a little bit about my family history. And then there were a couple of occasions when she volunteered a memory from the war. So yeah, actually, did I answer the question? Because now I can't quite remember the first part of it.
Yeah, you answered the part about looking for trigger events, but Catherine also asked about how did you do this research? What kind of sources did you use and things like that?
Yeah, so I did mostly secondary research. I did a large literature review on the Korean War, on the sex industry in Korea, but I did some archival research as well at the National Archives on the Korean War. And that's ongoing. I'm planning for a next project to do another round of archival research, sort of looking more closely at how the US conceived of that war and thinking about the after effects of it on American race relations. Mm-hmm. So I really love doing archival research because it's sometimes you get these revelations that in today's context just seem like, it's kind of outrageous that people thought this or said it and put it in a memo, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I found was a memo about strafing civilians, right, from low-flying aircraft. Strafing of civilians is an excellent method of clearing a roadway. If you're trying to clear out, a blocked road, you just bomb them from above, and that'll make them go away.
Oh my gosh!
Right? So it's like it seems so natural. It seemed so natural at the time, probably for the military to say things like that. But to us now that I think that the global community has a bit more sensitivity around trying to avoid harming civilians, but I think that wasn't so much the case then.
Yeah, and to say it so kind of like cavalierly and off the cuff, like it was,
Yeah.
this is what we do.
Yeah.
That's yeah. So your John is saying this book is so personal and relates to societal issues impacting your family. I wonder what would another book be about? But you just kind of talked about that. Would it will you continue to write about things that are personal and sociological, even in the academic context?
Yeah. So I mean, that's sort of my thing. Like going back to that question about the hybrid text,
Hmm.
it's like because I think that one of the things I realize that makes my writing special, like a little different than other people's, is that I really want to try to get an emotional texture into even work that is academic.
Hmm.
So and I think that the easiest way to do that is to bring to write about something that has a personal resonance for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's a way to engage an audience. But I think also, in the history of the social sciences, um, when I was in grad school, there were all these conversations about how we acknowledge that the researcher has biases of their own, because they're not just sort of coming in out of nowhere, that with what they see and the kinds of questions that they ask, the kinds of sources that they go to, they're all going to be influenced about what their own concerns are, what their own traumas are, and that we need to sort of make that transparent. And so I guess that my work as an academic has always really insisted on the importance of that.
Hmm. Yeah. So Jessica is asking, what was it like growing up Korean American in the town that you lived in? She says, I am Korean. Um, how does it feel to finally be able to hear more of our voices represented in the world today?
Oh yeah. So I mean, it was a really hard upbringing in that town, because my experience of it was that it was quite xenophobic, and there also wasn't a Korean American community there. So we were quite isolated, and even within my own family, because my dad was American, all of the relatives that we had, they were all on my dad's side. So we didn't really have access to my mom's side of the family, except during a couple of periods when we tried to arrange longer visits. So it was pretty isolating, and I definitely internalized that feeling that I was inferior because I was Asian.
Mhm.
And I know that my mom did too, because she did make a couple of comments to me about that when I was in junior high. But yeah, what does it feel like now? I think like it's been a long time coming that we are paying attention to Asian American writers, and the last few years, especially, we've had a lot of Korean American writers getting more acknowledgement. So yeah, I mean, I think that publishing and other types of media still have a long ways to go to fully represent voices and different issues. But I think we're making some progress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of kind of internalizing a lot of the xenophobia in the town that you grew up in, Jean is saying at times you sounded so angry about living in America. What was that about?
Well, it was about growing up in a town where I felt like I was constantly under attack. So, I mean, that's the short answer.
Yeah.
So it's like there were times when I did not think I was going to survive that town, where like as a teenager, I had suicidal thoughts. I remember once my French teacher pulling me aside because I had written, like, I was sort of in this advanced French independent study, and I could just write whatever I wanted. And I wrote this long thing about suicide. And so she pulled me aside and asked if I was all right. So I do, when I think about that town, the probably the biggest source of support I got was from my teachers. Sort of that was pretty consistent throughout my schooling. But I felt like, outside of that safe space of the classroom, for me, relatively safe space, I didn't feel safe growing up there.
Mhm.
And I think also because I sort of lived under this rhetoric of, having been rescued, of always being told you need to be grateful and you would be nothing if I hadn't brought you here, and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that feeling now, I mean, imagine has evolved all that much with of the violence that happens on Asians in America.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, that's always sort of been part of an undercurrent, and it's just back now, So, my own response to those surges in anti-Asian violence is that it is, it does sort of bring back memories of my childhood and my youth.
Mhm. So Martha is asking, when you were growing up, did you have to deal with many times of other kids thinking that you behave or live in certain ways, or you were stereotyped due to your Asian identity? And I think that you open the book with a story about that, right? About being chased by a bully and ultimately falling down into a ditch and them calling you a dog eater. So um, was that consistent throughout your whole childhood? It sounds like probably.
Yeah. I mean, there are a few moments like that that stand out in my memory, and I think that I did block some of it out. So I don't know, like I can't exactly quantify how consistent it was, but definitely like throughout the years, I could point to incidents like that. So there was that. There was, sort of like the sort of exaggerating my difference in that way, and like that bully that I referred to actually thought that we had eaten our own dog. We had a pet dog that died, and then she said, "Oh, the dog's not there because you ate it." So there were things like that. But then on the other hand, and I mentioned that as well, this idea that we have now about microaggressions,
Mhm.
where there were other kids who, instead of pointing to my difference, would try to point to my sameness, and they'd say, "Oh, you're like us. You're not like those other Asians," And so then they would feel freer to make racial slurs in front of me because they thought they saw me as not like that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even after that, like after that story, you again went into this lovely history about some of the stigmas within Korean culture itself, including eating dogs and how
Mhm.
the
Right.
people who capture dogs in Korea were highly stigmatized.
Yes, right.
That was very interesting. Rose is asking, based on your experiences and professional work, what improvements need to be made to close the inequality gaps in mental health care for Asians and other people of color?
Mhm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that for me, what I always sort of come back to is this idea that in the US, we have sort of reduced mental health care, our ideas of what mental health care is,
Mhm.
to medication. And that doesn't work for everyone. And it's also, yeah, I mean, it doesn't work for everyone. And it also can make things worse in some situations. So I think that we need to really think broadly about what mental health care is if we're going to reach the people who really need it.
Mhm.
And so um, one thing that I wished that I had known earlier, when my mom was going through all of these struggles, was about the Hearing Voices movement, which started I think it started in Denmark, but it's pretty big in the UK, which is sort of peer-to-peer support for people who hear voices. They don't use the diagnostic language of schizophrenia because of the way that that's stigmatizing, and it offers people support in how to manage their own voices and live with them. And so some of them do it with medication, some of them do it without, but it has been shown to be much more useful than medication alone,
Mhm.
in some of the studies. And I think about what mental health care looks like in terms of providing basic needs and, material needs, but also just the need for safety. And so there needs to be a lot of change structurally. And so that, when we talk about providing people with mental health care services, does that also mean providing them with housing? Does it also mean providing them with safe communities? So I think that we need to think about it along those lines.
Mhm. And how do we do that even within our own families? Because the discussion of mental illness, even within our own families, is still wrought with stigma and shame. And Julianne is asking, how do we talk about it with the people that we need to talk about it with the most?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that was something I was not successful at. So, I don't know that I have the best answer for that, but I think you're right that it is stigmatized within families, and that the person who brings it up might be particularly resented for doing so. So, I think I just keep going back to like peer support, of finding other people who might be going through the same kind of struggle regarding having a person in their family with a mental health challenge. One of the things I encountered in my research about schizophrenia was that in families that had sort of these, I guess, I think it was the term was called expressed emotion. When the family expressed, negative feelings about the person's mental health status openly, that the outcome for the person really went down. So I think that within a family, you all need to find a way to be able to talk about what's going on, but without making that person feel like they're a problem. Because I think even a lot of the literature still does that in mental health literature.
Peggy is saying, I was spellbound by your memoir, especially the details of your mother's illness. Was her relentless repetition of physical activity, including foraging, pie baking, and detailed washing of dishes, her mind or body's way of staying in the moment, do you think, and therefore keeping her past atrocities at bay? Without those things, may she have succumbed to schizophrenia sooner?
Mhm. That's a really interesting question. I mean, I really don't know, other than that, I guess when I was younger, I always sort of saw her as someone who was ambitious. Like, even if she was not able to achieve anything that conformed to, traditional notions of success, she always wanted to be really good at whatever it was she was doing. So she was really skilled at whatever task that she took on. But yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And I think that to counter that question, I gave another talk where someone in the audience asked, do you think that your mother's schizophrenia was a way of escaping this violence? And it was, that to be in this state where you're sort of isolated and, you're hearing voices, is that in itself a kind of refuge, which I thought was a very radical thought and almost the opposite of this one, so.
Yeah, keeping busy versus disassociating.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. We have a lot of questions about whether or not you fear for your own mental health or that of your family, your children.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, my mom she was 45 when I noticed the onset of her transformation. Sometimes I don't know what the right language to use, because I tend to fall back on the sort of the psychiatric language, even though I critique it. So I want to try to find other ways of talking about it. But so I saw her start to change when she was 45. And there is now in our knowledge today, we know that that a drop in estrogen for women can create some of these changes. So there's a strong link between hormonal changes and mental health changes. But in 1986, nobody knew that because the research hadn't been done yet. And so, especially as I was nearing the age that my mom was, I started to, become a little fearful. It wasn't always on the surface, but I would have nightmares that I was hallucinating, and I couldn't tell the difference between what was in my head and what was external.
Yeah.
But now, since I've actually passed that age, I feel more secure now. But as far as my child goes, I worry about his mental health for other reasons, not because of my mom's, not because he carries any genetic material from my mom, because, the data says that the grandchild of someone who was diagnosed with schizophrenia has the same chances of getting it as the general population. So that, that risk factor is basically just for the first generation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so with my child, he's very sensitive, and I worry about his mental health just being in a world that is violent, and I try to protect him from a lot of that. But so, yeah. And I think that just because I spent so much time struggling with my mom's mental health, that I do fear it, having to do that again with someone else, just because it's very draining. And despite the fact that I have learned so much, I still don't know that I would, necessarily know what to do. just because the infrastructure isn't adequate for giving people what they need.
Yep, that's true. So let's get to the food memoir part of the book. How did cooking bring you and your mother closer?
So it's interesting because when I first started to cook for her, she rejected almost everything that I cooked, and it was really frustrating. And so it did not bring us closer. It actually sort of pushed me away a little bit. But over time, she sort of gradually started to accept what I was offering her. And so we would have these sort of, bonding moments over the food if it was something that was new and exciting to her. But initially, part of the reason was that she did not want me to be a cook. She wanted me to be a scholar. And so she saw those two things at odds with each other. And so I think she thought that maybe she was interfering with, her hope for me that I would become a scholar. But I think things really started to change. So once she started to accept my cooking, then she would ask for Korean dishes. And at first they were things from my childhood. And so it was like a bit of nostalgia for me. And then after a while, she would ask for these dishes that I had never even heard of, and they were from her childhood. So that was, I think, that, the most important thing in our journey together through the meals, that it's what opened up the past, right? So it gave me access to this family history that I had never had access to before, in the way that she taught me how to cook my grandmother's dishes. And I think that it opened up the past for her, because eating those things after like 40 or 50 years, I think it provided a kind of safety in that experience of eating those foods and remembering my grandmother, so that she could tell me things about her past that she had never shared before. Yeah.
And still in a way that was indirectly telling you about her past.
Yeah, right.
He's so vulnerable.
Yeah, right. Because I never pried. I would try to be very careful about asking her questions and just sort of not pursue any line of questioning that seemed to make her uncomfortable. But yeah, it was like the food would trigger a memory, and then she would share this memory about the food, like a scene from, when she last ate it, or something like that. And so it would give me these glimpses of her as a child, or my grandfather. I've never seen pictures of anybody on my mom's side of the family who wasn't alive during my lifetime, because all of the family photos got burned up during the war. So it allowed me the sort of sensory image of them, even though it wasn't a visual image necessarily, but I have an image now in my body through those experiences. So it wasn't just that it brought us closer together. I feel like it brought me closer to, my ancestors as well.
Yeah. So Emil is asking, do you think it was the taste of the food, or the preparation, or even the combination of the experience that helped to bring the past into the present for your mother? Yeah, that's an interesting question. What do you think? It was a combination of all of them?
Yeah, I do think it was a combination, because, smell and taste are supposed to be the strongest sense memories, or strongest senses related to memory. So that if you eat something that you haven't had for many years, it's going to bring you back to that moment. But I think that there was also something about the preparation, because, I have this scene in the book where I was 5 years old and I said I wanted to be a cook when I grew up, and my mom flipped out. She said, "No, you're going to be a professor, or a doctor, or something like that." And then she never taught me how to cook. So this is a moment, late in her life, where she actually does teach me how to cook. And so it sort of resolved this old wound that I was carrying, that I always felt like she didn't really give me the freedom to do what I wanted to do. And so it was a resolution of that particular knot. But I think it was also just all the time that we spent together eating those meals, So yeah, I mean, it was a combination of all of those things.
Food heals. It has
Yeah.
its mysterious ways. Stephen is asking, what is your favorite Korean?
My favorite Korean dish?
Mhm.
Probably mianguk, which is seaweed soup, because I have a lot of childhood memories attached to it, It's you eat it on birthdays. My mom used to always cook it for me on my birthday, and I cook it for my child a lot. So it's one of a few Korean dishes that he really likes.
Mhm. We've had quite a few people ask, specifically Linda and Susan, where can I find recipes for some of the dishes your mother made? They sound so good. And what was an easy recipe from basically, is your next book going to be a cookbook?
No, I don't think so. You can probably find most of them online. Like, there's Mangchi, Maang. How do you spell her name? Mangchi, who is sort of like a Korean cook, celebrity chef on YouTube.
Mhm.
So you can find a lot of recipes through her. One dish that you can so one unusual dish, or one unusual in the US, is konkuksu. So I wrote about that one. It's the soybean soup, and it's very simple. So you can find that recipe online, and because it only has a few ingredients, yet it's incredibly flavorful.
Mm.
So, I recommend trying that one. If you have a blender, you'll need a blender for making the soy milk for it.
Okay. Madeline is asking, can you share the importance of shopping for, preparing, and sharing of food in the Korean culture, and how it maybe would have helped to heal? Um, she says, I just finished reading Crying in H Mart and was fascinated by the elevated position that foods hold within the family and culture.
Mhm.
So you mentioned your mother foraged a lot too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know that I can answer that first question, just because I grew up with that, very disconnected from Korean culture, because, we were isolated in this town. And so, and I don't really, I spent a couple of summers during my early childhood in Korea with my grandmother, but I don't really have memories of going shopping so much.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, aside from what I already shared about my experience with my mom, I don't know that I have that much to add. And I haven't read Crying in H Mart yet, even though everybody always asks me about that. But my mom was a forager. So she would go out into the woods and pick mushrooms, wild blackberries, fiddlehead ferns, all sorts of things like that. So, um, and I guess for me, it was interesting because I think it taught me how to be connected to nature
Mhm.
as a food source, so, and not really have this abstract relationship with food, not understanding where it comes from, that there's something kind of spiritual about that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I wish that I did more of that, or lived in a place that was possible.
Yeah.
Soon Me is saying, Grace, how would you describe your relationship with the Korean American community today?
Yeah. So it's, I don't know what the Korean American community consists of, because I don't know that I've ever been part of any mainstream community.
Okay.
But when I moved to New York, I think probably around the time that I started grad school, I became involved with a Korean American community organization that was based in Queens. A lot of progressive Koreans, a lot of queer Koreans, adoptees, biracial people, basically a collection of Korean Americans who felt like they were sort of on the outside of that larger Korean American community. And sort of that's was my avenue into feeling connected to community. And it's a relationship that I value very highly, because I don't think that the work that I've done would have been possible without the support that I've gotten from them, the knowledge that I've gotten from them, and also the kinship relationships. So I've developed a couple of relationships through that organization that are familial relationships to me now. So they're like chosen family.
Mhm. That's excellent. Teresa is saying, what would you tell your younger self in order to develop more confidence, for your younger self?
hmm Um, I kind of feel like the whole book is in a way also written for that younger self, to try to, acknowledge the experiences that I went through, and also to write the trajectory out of that, so maybe what I would say to my younger self is that, that my mom was right. Your ticket out of your misery in this town is to go to college, listen to your mom. Um, Yeah, I don't know. I haven't actually thought about it that much other than what I've already written in the book.
So Peggy is saying then, given your unique background, I guess this kind of piggybacking off of this question, and where you are now, what truths do you believe are necessary for continued growth?
What truths are necessary broadly? Truths broadly?
For your continued growth, yeah, I guess.
Yeah. Um, I guess I would just reiterate what I already said, that I think it's really important for people to feel free to be who they are without fear of some sort of retribution or judgment.
Mhm.
So that I think that is one of my core values. And so and another is that just in terms of thinking about my own journey, and going back to what I said about like forming these other kinship relationships that are sort of outside of my, biological family, to just remember that I have this incredible support network,
Mhm.
and that enables me to do my work, that enables me to feel like a grounded and legitimate person operating in the world,
Mhm.
um, and just to but, I also always wanna remember where I came from, so that's why I always sort of return to thinking about family history.
Yeah, and it's also important to keep in mind and know that family can be found.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
So you've talked a bit about your first book, Haunting the Korean Diaspora. So what are do you think the similarities and differences of terms of writing craft between those two?
Mhm.
Because we have a lot of people asking how you manage to keep up with your academic responsibilities while also balancing writing, even for non-academic purposes, which was Tastes Like War, even though
Mhm.
it was incredibly educational.
Mhm. The differences in writing craft, well, I think that with an academic work, I don't know that no one uses the word craft. There are certain conventions that you're expected to follow, but I actually didn't follow them. I sort of saw it as a writing experiment.
Mhm.
And with Taste Like War, I was a little bit more conscious of some craft elements because I took some basic memoir workshops. And so I had, just basic things like how to write scenes, how to write dialogue and things of that nature. But then, weaving in the scholarly stuff and sort of, breaking it up a little bit into these different voices, that was just something that carried over from my first book. And it just sort of came intuitively to me since I had already done it. Um, so yeah, I think that is the difference. But as far as making time for it with academic responsibilities, each of those books took me many years to write. Like Hunting the Korean Diaspora, from the time I started researching until it came out, was 10 years, and then Taste Like War was 12. So now it's, I have the question about how to write on a different timeline,
Mhm.
especially now that I think there are expectations that I come out with a new book in less than 10 years, because I have a wider readership now. So now it's a bit more challenging. And so I used to write in this way where I didn't try to write when I didn't have a long block of time to write because I found it too disruptive. But now I'm trying to do it in these little chunks, which is very new to me.
Mhm.
But I think it's been helpful to, even if it's just one thought, because, I'm thinking of the next project not so much as, my writing goal being I have to produce a certain number of words, but rather a thought, because I think it's going to be a little bit more in the realm of criticism, so that I have to generate a lot of ideas that I'm going to connect. So every day, at least I want to write, either read something that sparks a thought or just do some free writing that sparks a thought.
Mhm.
And I don't get to do it every day, but I'm maybe doing it like 4 or 5 times a week. So that's how I'm doing it. And it's just in these very small chunks of time, sometimes just like 20 minutes.
That's great insight. I know that people always ask, how do I do this? How do I set aside time? So it's always good insight to see how other writers are doing it.
Mhm.
Okay, so we are at the top of the hour. So I want to close with the question that we get all the time. What is your favorite book? What do you recommend that everybody runs out to their library and checks out immediately?
Oh gosh, I don't know that I have a favorite book, but one of the best books I've read in a long time is a new book. It's called Easy Beauty by Chloe Cooper Jones. And so, it's similar to mine only in the sense that it weaves together memoir with scholarship.
Mhm.
But she writes about she's a philosopher, and the philosophy side of it is thinking about our ideas about beauty. And the memoir side of it is that she is a person with a disability. And so she asks all these questions about what it is like to, move through the world in a body that is always marked as disabled and never included in our conventional notions of beauty. And it's just really beautifully written and also so thought-provoking.
Yeah.
So that's my recommendation.
And what was Chloe's full name again?
Chloe Cooper Jones.
Okay, Chloe Cooper Jones.
Is beauty.
Okay, so with that, we are going to wrap things up. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Cho.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it and enjoyed it.
It's truly been a pleasure to speak with you about this beautiful and super important work. So thank you very much. I also want to extend a huge thank you, of course, to all of our viewers that are tuning in to the Author Talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. And so we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video, you can find a link to Dr. Cho's book. We look forward to seeing you all on February 28th when we talk to award-winning author Sadekwa Johnson about her new book and this month's pick for Reese's Book Club, The House of Eve. You can register for this and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us.